Hi, good evening. My name is David Bloom. I'm a social studies teacher here at Niskayuna High School. Welcome to the 6th annual Evening in History. Our program tonight is a commemoration of the year 1989 with the 1980s as its larger theme. Through historical speech and song, our goal is to educate, to acknowledge, to inspire, to reflect, and most of all, to tell a story of a time and place. Many thanks to the students, faculty, and staff who you will see and hear this evening. I'd like to personally acknowledge the work of Mr. Brian O'Connor, the advisor and driving force of the Broadcast Club, and the creator of the slideshow. Quick shout out to all the faculty and staff who participated as well. The trio of great men from the music department, Mr. Phil Pandori, Mr. Dave Fisk, and Mr. Eric Hughes. Mrs. Maria Germain, Mr. Sean O'Connell, and Mr. Michael Dickerson, who spun the tunes for this evening's dance party. A special thanks from me to my co-creator, the totally awesome, totally tubular, radical Mrs. Christina Catalano. In speaking of the 1980s, journalist Tina Brown writes that the ascent of Ronald Reagan to the White House in 1981, quote, marked the definitive end of one era, that of the turbulent 1960s and its threadbare 70s endgame, and the supersonic launch of another Gilded Age. Tax cuts for the wealthy in 1981 unleashed animal spirits on Wall Street. Go-getters in suspenders, their eyes ablaze with the thrill of winning, thrived in an orgy of mergers. The sidewalks of New York were filling with stretched limos, while the adjacent streets were filled with homeless. When asked to define the 1980s, U.S. Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan said, quote, "We borrowed $1 trillion from the foreigners and we used the money to throw a big party." By 1980, the world had also entered into its 5th decade with no end in sight of the threat of a collective nuclear destruction. But on the night of the 9th of November 1989, according to journalist Fareed Zakaria, quote, "the 20th century ended with a bang. As the most visible symbol of the Cold War, the wall separating East and West Berlin came down, with historical consequences and reverberations that continue to challenge the community of nations." In the selections presented tonight, you will hear from a variety of sources that tell the story of a decade that featured Pope John Paul II, and Margaret Thatcher, Lech Walesa and Nelson Mandela, Lake Placid and Tiananmen Square, Hulk Hogan and the Iron Sheik, CNN and the personal computer, the AIDS crisis and the moral majority. So ultimately, how should we view this decade? It's probably a little bit more than just fluorescent spandex. In his bestseller, Sleepwalking Through History, the esteemed journalist Haynes Johnson makes the claim that, quote, "in their impact on economic, social, political, government life, and on the attitudes and personal values of Americans, the 1980s were the most important years since World War II. As always, we give you our best snapshot of the era, and we leave the conclusions up to you." Part 1 of the program, Berlin, and we will slide into part 2 as well. Built in 1961 to stem the tide of political refugees fleeing from the communist East to the free West, journalist Michael Myers said of the concrete and barbed wire Berlin Wall, quote, "Nothing has ever been so freighted with symbolism, ideology, and history. The wall was World War II, the Cold War, the Iron Curtain, the high tide of totalitarianism, and communist dictatorship, the frontier of democracy. You could feel it, smell it, run your hands over it, look across it. On the one side, us. On the other side, them." This section of the program presents famous lines delivered by an American president in the shadow of the Brandenburg Gate, as well as accounts of the wall's first appearance and life behind the wall in the 1980s. Don't worry, we'll get to the fall of the wall at the end of the program. We will then flow into a selection of music and song lyrics from the 1980s, both fun and serious, reflective of the ideological struggle of the times, a plea for understanding, a tribute to a friend. There is one change in the program. For the Tracy Chapman piece, we will have Emma Flashpolar, and Michael Dickerson will be reading the Mario Cuomo speech.
In the 1950s, Premier Khrushchev predicted, "We will bury you." But in the West today, we see a free world that has achieved a level of prosperity and well-being unprecedented in all human history. In the communist world, we see failure, technological backwardness, declining standards of health, even want of the most basic kind: too little food. Even today, the Soviet Union cannot feed itself. After these 4 decades then, there stands before the entire world one great and inescapable conclusion: freedom leads to prosperity. Freedom replaces the ancient hatreds among the nations with comity and peace. Freedom is the victor. And now the Soviets themselves may, in a limited way, be coming to understand the importance of freedom. We hear much from Moscow about a new policy of reform and openness. Some political prisoners have been released. Certain foreign news broadcasts are no longer being jammed. Some economic enterprises have been permitted to operate with greater freedom from state control. Are these the beginnings of profound changes in the Soviet state? Or are they token gestures intended to raise false hopes in the West, or to strengthen the Soviet system without changing it? We welcome change and openness, for we believe that freedom and security go together, that the advance of human liberty can only strengthen the cause of world peace. There is one sign the Soviets can make that would be unmistakable, that would advance dramatically the cause of freedom and peace. General Secretary Gorbachev, if you seek peace, if you seek prosperity for the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, if you seek liberalization, come here to this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
I was a 14-year-old army dependent living in a German neighborhood of Bad Kreuznach, Germany. My father was a major, my mother was German. No one had televisions on our street. News came by human contact, newspapers, and telephones. The night the wall went up, the beginning of the process anyway, my family was in our home. We began to hear people outside yelling, crying louder and louder. We went into the street to witness tragic panic and fear. Neighbors were telling each other and us that they had relatives in East Berlin. They tried to contact them but couldn't, that no one knew what was happening. Rumors spread. Some thought that their relatives had been killed or would soon be killed. I'd never witnessed anything like this. Everyone cried. As time went on, neighbors told us that they thought their loved ones behind the wall were lost and lost for good. I'm sure some of those lost relations died, period. The night is etched in my permanent memory.
East Berlin, 1980s. When in East Berlin, everything looked different. Even the light appeared different to me. The GDR was a very dogmatic state, so most things, from architecture to television to organization of everyday life, had an ideologic aspect, and one could feel this when moving in East Berlin. My uncle and his wife lived in one of those houses in a small apartment. I remember they had the window open in deep winter. My father explained to me that they wouldn't have to pay for the heating, so they would leave the windows open, and it was warm because the heating ran full throttle. I remember how we went into a bookstore and my uncle would buy books for my sister and me. I was thankful, but at the same time I felt strange, because the books were low quality compared to the fine paper and good bindings and modern cover graphics we had in the West. Not to forget that the stories were always somehow connected to Russia in my memory.
Tommy used to work on the docks. Unions been on strike. He's down on his luck. It's tough, so tough. She says we gotta hold on to what we got. It doesn't make a difference if we make it or not. We've got each other, and that's a lot for love. We'll give it a shot. Whoa, we're halfway there. Whoa, living on a prayer. Take my hand, we'll make it, I swear. Whoa, living on a prayer. Living on a prayer. Whoa, we're halfway there. Whoa, living on a prayer. Take my hand, we'll make it, I swear. Whoa, living on a prayer. Living on a prayer. Paint your smile on your lips. Blood red nails on your fingertips. Chains of love got a hold on me. When passion's a prison, you can't break free. Oh, there's nowhere to run. No one can save me. The damage is done. Shot through the heart, and you're to blame. You give love a bad name. Bad name. I play my part, and you play your game. You give love a bad name. Bad name. You give love a bad name. Shot through the heart, and you're to blame. You give love a bad name. I play my part, and you play your game. You give love a bad name. You give love